Hello, this is Sean Collins for Tutorial 3, Normal Cardiopulmonary Response to Activity in the Chronic Cardiopulmonary Conditions Care Path Tutorials. I'm probably going to break this one up into two pieces. It turns out that Tutorial 2 was slightly larger than I had anticipated, and still figuring out how I'm going to break that into pieces. So this one, I'm just going to create two sections of it right off the bat. So Tutorial 3 will have a Part 1 and a Part 2. So that's just forewarned. Tutorial 3 here is on the normal cardiopulmonary response to activity. And the variables we're going to be primarily interested in are all related to one another, and I'm going to emphasize those that are easily obtainable in the home care setting, but I'm also going to give you some information about variables that you will not be able to obtain through the normal clinical examination process in the home, but that provide further insight into the response so that you can better interpret the variables that you do have access to. So the variables you have access to are heart rate, blood pressure, and at this point it will be important to separate out systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, respiratory rate. Those are all quantifiable variables. These two together give us the pulse pressure. You can also get information about the rating of perceived exertion. So those are quantifiable, and then this is quantifiable but also subjective. On the more qualifiable, we've got things like shortness of breath, breathing pattern. Another quantifiable one would be chest wall excursion, inspiratory capacity, breathing pattern. So these are, how could I have forgotten? SpO2, quantifiable, and it does have a normal response to activity. Okay. To keep us going back and being oriented to the algorithm, we are really in this part. We're introducing this section here, really. Is endurance limited due to disease-specific impairments? And in considering if endurance is limited to disease-specific impairments, we're going to be interested in the relative response to limiting workload. In particular, the signs during limiting symptoms. Are there signs of cardiac, ventilatory, or respiratory decompensation? But before we can talk about whether there are signs of decompensation, we have to talk about what are the signs of normal compensation. What are the signs that the cardiac, ventilatory, and respiratory systems are responding as they should during workloads, even limiting workloads? Now, as in the discussion about resting stability, we have a heuristic here that will come up in the next two tutorials, that unexpected findings get attention. In order, that's to say that unexpected findings are what we focus on in determining whether there are signs of decompensation. Flipping that around, a sign of decompensation of the cardiac, ventilatory, or respiratory system would be an unexpected finding in the cardiopulmonary response to exercise. So, in order to identify the unexpected findings, you need to know what's expected. You need to know what is expected. We really should consider a variety of workloads, a variety of workload scenarios. So let me define the workload scenarios that we're going to be considering. First one we will call graded, and the second one we will call steady state. So graded, if we have time and we have work. Work is on the x-axis, time is on the y-axis. Over time we have increments, whether they be stepwise, linear. We have continuous increase in the workload. Steady state, we've got some increase in workload, and it might even be a couple of steps, but at some point workload then becomes, well, steady. So an example of graded work would be a protocol in the treadmill or around a track where you continuously go faster, or it's steeper, and you continuously have greater demands. Where a steady state would be like standing up from seated. Standing up might get you to this workload, and then starting to walk might get you to the next workload. And continuing to walk keeps you at that workload, assuming you continue. Now these are examples of the absolute intensity. But when we talk about the cardiopulmonary response to activity, we're talking about the physiological variables and how they change with this absolute intensity. So let's start with the case of graded workloads, and let's just have time. Now, because this is a graded workload, we could also have workload. Time and workload are linearly related for a graded workload. So if I were to remind you, we have time and work. They go together, so if they're correlated so closely, we could keep them together on this axis. So when you're looking at time increases, you're looking at workload increases. So let's take heart rate. Heart rate during workload increases tends to, well, it's never really down at 0, so no need to start down there. It increases linearly. Systolic blood pressure increases linearly. Cardiac output increases linearly. Ventilation increases linearly. Carbon dioxide production increases linearly. At a point along the process, it continues to increase linearly, but at a different rate, so it changes its slope. Diastolic blood pressure. I'm going to denote that one. Stays the same. So earlier, I told you that systolic blood pressure minus diastolic blood pressure equals pulse pressure. If systolic blood pressure is going up during exercise, graded exercise, and diastolic blood pressure is staying the same, then pulse pressure is going up during exercise. And that makes sense. You want to pump more blood, you need a larger pressure gradient for that blood to be pushed. Stroke volume. I'm going to make another chart here for stroke volume. The amount of blood ejected from the heart with each beat. This tends to increase logarithmically. It plateaus at about 50% of the workload. Respiratory rate and tidal volume have variable responses in different people, but they both can be said to roughly increase linearly. In most people, respiratory rate increases linearly, and tidal volume, or the amount you breathe in per breath, increases linearly and then actually breaks down a little bit. So these are general normal responses during graded workloads. I want to show you, before I end this and do a second session on the normal responses, I want to show you how some of these variables are related. So, oxygen consumption. Is equal to cardiac output multiplied by the difference in oxygen between the arteries and the veins. Cardiac output equals the stroke volume multiplied by the heart rate. Blood pressure equals the cardiac output multiplied by the total peripheral resistance. Ventilation equals the respiratory rate multiplied by tidal volume. But tidal volume is more often, sorry about this, more often represented as VT, not TV. How this becomes important is that it sets the stage for you to understand what you can measure and what you can infer. We can measure blood pressure. So when we see changes in blood pressure, we can infer changes in cardiac output and peripheral resistance. Between the two, cardiac output and total peripheral resistance, cardiac output is more strongly weighted by systolic blood pressure and peripheral resistance by diastolic blood pressure. So if systolic blood pressure is going up, it tends to be related to the increase in cardiac output. Diastolic blood pressure stays the same. Now, if you think about this, diastolic blood pressure is staying the same despite the fact that we've pumped much more blood, up to 4 times more blood, into the arteries during exercise than at rest. And despite that, the diastolic blood pressure stays the same. And the reason it can do that is because of a decrease in total peripheral resistance. And that decrease in total peripheral resistance is really a function of vasodilation. So during exercise, blood vessels vasodilate, reducing total peripheral resistance, allowing us to maintain diastolic blood pressure despite the fact that we've got up to 4 times more blood being pumped into the circuit, into the arteries. While the blood is being ejected, because it is so much with each ejection, systolic blood pressure does go up. The resultant increase in pulse pressure greatly increases the body's ability to deliver blood. I think we're going to stop here. I'm going to pick up from here in part 2 of normal cardiopulmonary responses to exercise. Thank you.